There was a world where wars aren't fought over territory, but over barrels, where the price of energy decides the fate of nations, and gold, once the foundation of global money, became irrelevant in a single backroom deal. In 1971, the dollar untethered from gold. But by 1974, it was backed by something far more powerful: oil. A secret pact with Saudi Arabia turned black crude into the true reserve currency. And every country on Earth suddenly needed dollars not for gold, but to keep the lights on. This is the story of how oil, not gold, came to rule the world's money, and why no one told you. August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon appears on national television and delivers a message that will rewrite the global financial order. The United States is temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. With that single announcement, the Bretton Woods system, built in 1944 to anchor world currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce, ceases to exist. Overnight, the monetary foundation of the post-war era evaporates. The US dollar, the world's reserve currency, is no longer tethered to any tangible asset. The implications are staggering. Trillions of dollars held by foreign governments and central banks have just become paper-backed by trust alone. Gold, once the anchor of monetary discipline, is cast aside in favor of flexibility, discretion, and control. Officially, Nixon blames foreign speculators, inflation, and an unfair trade imbalance. Unofficially, the real reason runs deeper. After decades of war spending, deficits, and foreign aid programs, America's gold reserves are shrinking fast, unable to match the volume of dollars circulating abroad. France has already begun redeeming its dollars for bullion, shipping tons of gold across the Atlantic. Other countries are preparing to follow. The math is clear. If redemption continues, Fort Knox will run dry. Nixon's move isn't just about stopping the hemorrhage, it's about transforming a liability into a strategic advantage. By breaking the gold link, the U.S. gains something unprecedented: the ability to issue the world's money without the constraint of physical reserves. No more redemptions, no more limits. The dollar becomes a fiat currency, purely symbolic, enforced not by convertibility, but by global reliance. Yet this newfound freedom comes at a cost. Without gold, why should any other nation accept the dollar as the global standard? Why should oil-exporting countries, trade partners, or foreign central banks hold dollars when their value can be printed into oblivion? These questions ignite a quiet panic across Europe and the Middle East. Behind closed doors, policymakers scramble to assess the implications. Economists warn of inflationary spirals, capital flight, and a collapse in U.S. credibility. But inside the Nixon administration, another plan is already taking shape. One that sees beyond gold, beyond paper, and into the bloodstream of the modern world: oil. What if the dollar could be anchored not to gold, but to the one commodity every country needs to survive? What if energy itself could become the new monetary standard? The public sees a monetary crisis. Washington sees a strategic reset. Nixon's decision doesn't mark the end of American monetary power. It marks its reinvention. Gold is dead. But something darker, more adaptable, and far more profitable is about to take its place. The golden promise has ended. The oil era is about to begin. In the months following Nixon's announcement, the global financial system begins to unravel with unnerving speed. Without gold backing the dollar, trust, already fragile, is shattered. Foreign central banks, suddenly holding vast reserves of unanchored paper, begin quietly dumping dollars in favor of gold, triggering a brutal sell-off in currency markets. France leads the charge. President Georges Pompidou, carrying forward de Gaulle's warnings, orders massive conversions of dollars into bullion, repatriating gold from New York vaults and shipping it to Paris under armed guard. Switzerland follows suit, doubling its gold reserves within months, turning its alpine vaults into sanctuaries of monetary sanity. Meanwhile, in West Germany, policy hawks call for revaluation of the mark, fearing imported inflation from an increasingly unstable dollar. Across Europe, governments prepare contingency plans for a post-dollar world, while in the oil-rich Gulf states, ministers grow restless, wondering how long they can continue selling their most precious resource in a currency that now floats on faith alone. The markets respond with panic. The price of gold, once fixed, explodes. climbing from $35 an ounce to over $100 by 1973. Inflation surges across the Western world, eroding savings and upending wages. American consumers feel the sting first. Groceries, gasoline, and rent all climb at alarming rates. But the deeper crisis is one of credibility. For the first time in the modern era, the world's monetary anchor has no metal beneath it. Financial publications begin publishing dire forecasts. The Financial Times warns of an impending dollar collapse. The Bundesbank demands monetary reform. And while the Federal Reserve scrambles to maintain control through interest rate tweaks, it is clear that monetary policy alone cannot restore confidence. Diplomats shuttle between capitals in search of new agreements. The Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971 attempts to create a new system of fixed exchange rates with wider bands, but the markets quickly test its limits. Within a year, it collapses. The world is sliding toward a new reality, floating currencies, financial volatility, and an American dollar whose primacy is slipping fast. Inside the Nixon White House, Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary John Connally understand the stakes. The dollar must not just survive, it must dominate. Without gold, another foundation must be found, one that all nations need, one that cannot be replaced, one that moves entire economies with every barrel. That foundation is oil. As global panic grows and confidence evaporates, American strategists begin to see an elegant solution emerging from the chaos. If the United States can link the dollar to oil, it can restore demand for its currency without ever needing to back it with bullion. And unlike gold, oil is not stored in vaults. It is burned every day. It is a necessity, not a luxury. And every nation will need it, no matter the cost. The dollar's collapse is not inevitable if it can be tied to the very fuel that powers the modern world. A new empire is forming, not in gold bars, but in oil barrels. In October 1973, geopolitical tensions ignite a global economic inferno. Following U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, announced an oil embargo targeting the United States and several Western allies. Almost overnight, oil exports from the Middle East slow to a trickle. Prices spiked from $3 to nearly $12 per barrel, a 400% increase in less than 6 months. Gasoline shortages paralyze American cities. Long lines stretch around fuel stations. Speed limits are slashed. Heating bills skyrocket. Europe reels from the shock. Japan is brought to its knees. What appears to be a crisis of energy is in reality a crisis of money. The commodity that once flowed cheaply now demands the world pay dearly, and it demands payment in dollars. But this chaos is no accident of fate. For Washington, it is the inflection point they've been waiting for. In secret strategy sessions, U.S. policymakers recognize an opportunity disguised as disaster. Every nation needs oil. If oil is priced exclusively in dollars, then every nation will need dollars, regardless of gold, regardless of trust, regardless of what backs it. Nixon's detachment from gold in 1971 had unleashed inflation and global doubt. But the oil embargo opens the door to a new architecture. Through oil, the dollar can regain its throne. All it needs is a deal. Behind closed doors, American diplomats and intelligence officials move swiftly. Talks begin with the House of Saud, the undisputed heavyweight of the oil world. Saudi Arabia controls the world's largest reserves and holds enormous influence within OPEC. The United States offers an irresistible package: military protection for the Saudi regime, weapons deals of unprecedented scale, and access to the full might of the U.S. financial system. In exchange, the Saudis must do two things. First, sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. Second, reinvest those dollar revenues into U.S. treasuries and American banks. The Saudis agree. What starts as a handshake soon transforms into a global structure. By pricing oil in dollars, the United States forces every nation on earth to hold and transact in American currency. From Japan to Germany, from Brazil to India, countries must now export goods, run trade surpluses, and accumulate dollars just to keep their lights on. The dollar, once backed by gold, is now backed by oil and enforced by necessity. As oil becomes the new standard of value, the United States regains control of global money without having to exchange a single ounce of gold. OPEC enforces the new rule not through policy papers but through scarcity. The oil shock makes one thing brutally clear. Energy is life, and oil is the oxygen of modern civilization. Now, the U.S. controls the valve, not by pumping oil, but by owning the currency it's sold in. The petrodollar order has begun. In June 1974, a delegation of American officials, led by Treasury Secretary William Simon, arrives in Riyadh under strict secrecy, carrying with them the blueprint for a global monetary transformation. The Saudi royal court listens carefully, flanked by advisors and oil ministers. The Americans come not as beggars pleading for oil access, but as architects of a new world order, one that will tie the fate of global money not to gold, but to Saudi crude. The deal is simple, but revolutionary. In exchange for pricing all oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars, the United States offers the kingdom full-spectrum military protection, intelligence sharing, and an unbreakable security guarantee that ensures the House of Saud remains untouchable, both at home and abroad. Billions in U.S. arms deals follow: fighter jets, tanks, radar systems, and a pipeline of spare parts and training that makes Saudi defense entirely dependent on American logistics. But it's the second half of the agreement that seals the financial pact. The Saudis agree to recycle their vast oil profits, their petrodollars, back into U.S. financial markets. They buy treasury bonds, fund U.S. banks, and invest in blue-chip American companies. These flows are laundered through quiet channels, often through Swiss intermediaries, to avoid political scrutiny. The scale is immense. Within a few years, Saudi petrodollar holdings in U.S. securities exceed $100 billion. The arrangement solves two existential problems at once. It stabilizes global demand for the dollar and ensures a steady buyer for America's growing debt. The Federal Reserve no longer needs gold to back the dollar because oil now enforces its global dominance. Countries that wish to purchase oil, and none can function without it, must first obtain dollars. This forces them to export goods to the United States or its dollar-aligned partners, turning trade into a mechanism of monetary dependency. Central banks begin stockpiling dollars as strategic reserves. Nations like Japan and West Germany restructure their entire financial systems to ensure smooth access to the currency that buys energy. The petrodollar becomes the new gold standard, unofficial, undeclared, and far more insidious. Unlike gold, oil is not hoarded. It is consumed. It disappears, barrel by barrel, into factories, vehicles, and power grids. This creates a perpetual need for new dollars, a treadmill of demand that allows the United States to run massive trade deficits without consequence. American deficits are no longer weaknesses. They are the delivery system for the world's energy currency. Every dollar printed finds its way back through oil markets and sovereign purchases of U.S. debt. This system, forged in a hidden handshake between Washington and Riyadh, replaces the gold standard with something far more dynamic: a geopolitical alliance fused with financial infrastructure. It is not enforced by redemption promises, but by tanks in the desert and tankers on the sea. And thus, with no fanfare, no headlines, and no public vote, the petrodollar system is born. It will shape the world for decades to come, and bind every nation's economic survival to the currency of one. By the late 1970s, the petrodollar system had matured into a seamless machine, humming quietly behind the roar of world trade. Oil-exporting nations, now flush with unprecedented dollar surpluses, began channeling their wealth into the very heart of the Western financial system. The Gulf monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, deposited billions into major Western banks, Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Barclays, who were eager to manage the new torrent of liquidity. But these dollars couldn't just sit idle. They had to move. And they did, outward in search of yield and influence. Thus began the era of petrodollar recycling, a process that would reshape the global economy in silence. Western banks, suddenly stuffed with petro-riches, began lending those dollars aggressively to the developing world. Latin American nations, African governments, and Southeast Asian economies, all desperate for energy imports and industrial expansion, lined up for loans. Countries that had barely recovered from colonial rule now took on debt at an industrial scale. From Nigeria to Brazil, from Indonesia to Mexico, dollar-denominated loans flooded national treasuries. The funds paid for oil imports, infrastructure projects, military purchases, and the illusion of prosperity. But there was a catch. These loans were not in local currency. They had to be repaid in dollars, locking borrowers into a permanent race to earn or borrow more of the currency they did not control. A closed loop emerged. Nations bought oil in dollars, paid those dollars to OPEC. OPEC invested those dollars in US and European banks, and those same banks relent the money to nations who needed more oil. The dollar circulated endlessly, not through trade alone, but through credit. Debt had replaced gold as the anchor of the system. And like gold once had, it created hierarchy. The United States no longer needed to export goods to maintain its monetary dominance. It exported debt. American deficits became the engine of global liquidity. And as long as other nations needed oil, they needed dollars, and as long as they needed dollars, they had to borrow them. The IMF and World Bank, staffed and funded by the same Western powers benefiting from this structure, began crafting policy frameworks to manage these debtor nations. Structural adjustment, austerity, and privatization became conditions for continued dollar access. The petrodollar system had evolved from an oil-for-currency trade to a financial architecture built on obligation. And unlike gold, which could be redeemed and held in vaults, debt demanded continuous servicing, continuous productivity, and continuous subordination. The developing world was no longer just borrowing money, it was buying access to energy and survival at the cost of long-term sovereignty. For the United States, the result was extraordinary. Global demand for dollars increased with every new loan, every new oil shipment, every new infrastructure project funded by recycled petro wealth. The dollar was no longer just the world's reserve currency, it had become the world's necessary debt. By the dawn of the 1980s, the flood of petrodollars coursing through the veins of the global economy had transformed not only banks and balance sheets, but the very institutions meant to ensure global financial stability. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, born at Bretton Woods as guardians of post-war monetary order, now adapted themselves to serve a new empire, one ruled not by gold convertibility but by dollar circulation. The IMF, originally designed to manage currency pegs and promote exchange rate stability, became the lender of last resort to countries drowning in petrodollar-fueled debt. As energy prices remained high and interest rates climbed to fight the inflation unleashed by fiat money, many developing nations found themselves trapped, locked into dollar-denominated loans that had suddenly doubled or tripled in real cost. The IMF swept in with bailouts, but the aid came with sharp strings attached: austerity programs, subsidy cuts, forced devaluation, privatization of state assets, and strict oversight of central banks. These weren't just financial adjustments, they were instruments of political engineering. Nations that once sought sovereignty through industrialization now found themselves reshaped by the invisible hand of dollar liquidity management. The World Bank followed a parallel path. Its development programs, once based on a mix of local and international currencies, began defaulting to dollar financing. Entire infrastructure projects, from power grids to ports, were funded with US dollars, repaid with interest, and subject to procurement requirements that often favored Western contractors. Technical assistance programs nudged governments toward deregulated markets, privatized utilities, and liberalized trade policies. The overarching logic was simple. To survive in an oil-dependent, dollar-based world, you had to play by the monetary rules written in Washington. Oil, once a commodity, had become an enforcement mechanism. If a nation lacked dollars, it lacked fuel. If it lacked fuel, its factories stalled, its lights dimmed, its buses stopped. And the only way to get dollars, beyond exporting enough goods to the US, was through the IMF, World Bank, or direct dollar loans. This system enshrined dependency not through conquest but through necessity. The U.S. Federal Reserve became the effective central bank of the world, with its interest rate decisions rippling from Jakarta to Johannesburg. When Paul Volcker hiked rates to 20% in the early 1980s to fight American inflation, entire nations collapsed under the weight of their dollar debt. Latin America plunged into its lost decade, while Africa's development was set back a generation. Behind every bond repayment and subsidy cut was the unspoken truth: control the currency and you control the outcomes. The dollar's supremacy was no longer a function of trust or gold. It was maintained through a network of institutions that could discipline governments, dictate fiscal policy, and reward or punish compliance. Oil provided the initial tether, institutions enforced the leash. What emerged was not merely a global economy, it was a global hierarchy, built on the infrastructure of financial obedience. As the petrodollar empire entrenched itself through the 1980s and 1990s, its greatest threat wasn't inflation, market volatility, or political dissent. It was the emergence of alternative systems. And the most potent alternative wasn't ideological, it was metallic. Gold, though cast aside by the dollar in 1971, never lost its symbolic power. Some nations, those marginalized by the dollar system, sanctioned by the West, or defiant of US-led financial control, began quietly amassing reserves and exploring a different path, pricing oil in currencies other than the dollar or even reverting to gold. Libya under Muammar Gaddafi led the most audacious charge. Flush with oil wealth, Gaddafi proposed a pan-African gold-backed dinar, a new regional currency intended to liberate African nations from the dollar, the euro, and the CFA franc. He called on Arab and African oil producers to sell their crude in gold, severing the petrodollar's chokehold and rerouting oil revenues into a new sovereign financial system. Iraq under Saddam Hussein followed a similar thread. In 2000, defying UN sanctions and US pressure, Baghdad announced it would begin selling oil for euros instead of dollars, a direct challenge to the dollar's exclusivity in energy markets. Iran, already at odds with Washington, launched its own oil bourse in the mid-2000s, attempting to sell crude in euros and other currencies, and steadily increased its gold reserves in response to escalating sanctions. These moves, while framed in the media as acts of tyranny, religious extremism, or rogue nationalism, struck at the heart of the post-1974 order. The requirement that oil flow only in dollars. For Washington, this wasn't just about policy, it was about survival of the dollar system. Military interventions followed. In 2011, NATO launched a bombing campaign in Libya under the guise of humanitarian protection during the Arab Spring. Within months, Gaddafi was killed by rebel forces. His gold reserves disappeared. The African gold dinar was never heard of again. Iraq's defiance ended in invasion. The 2003 war, officially justified by weapons of mass destruction and the threat of terrorism, dismantled the Ba'athist regime and reoriented Iraqi oil sales back into dollars. Iran, more resilient and strategically positioned, was subjected to waves of sanctions, cyber attacks, and economic sabotage aimed at isolating it from global trade systems. The pattern was unmistakable. Nations that threatened the petrodollar order didn't just face economic penalties, they faced regime change, isolation, or war. And while official narratives frame these actions as matters of national security, democracy, or human rights, the consistent through line was a monetary enforcement. The US military became the ultimate guarantor of the dollar's energy monopoly. It was no longer enough to influence markets or institutions. The currency had to be defended like territory. In this new age, oil didn't just fuel economies, it powered empire. And the empire couldn't allow rivals to resurrect gold as a competing foundation. The battle wasn't over ideology, it was over what gave money its power. Oil won, and its price was paid in blood, bombs, and billions. By the early 2000s, the petrodollar system had calcified into something eerily familiar, a new version of the old gold standard, but wrapped in geopolitics instead of metal. Central banks, once holders of gold bars in subterranean vaults, now hoarded US Treasury bonds with equal reverence. These paper promises, backed not by gold, but by the full faith and energy dominance of the United States, became the new global reserves. The petrodollar loop meant that oil-rich nations reinvested their surplus dollars into US debt, while energy-dependent countries accumulated treasuries to pay for oil imports. The cycle was seamless, self-reinforcing, and profoundly lopsided. Every dollar spent on oil, every interest payment on US debt, every international loan denominated in dollars. These all circled back to Washington, giving America unparalleled monetary privilege. But unlike the cold impartiality of gold, oil was volatile, political, and alive. It could be embargoed, sanctioned, or disrupted by war, and so could the dollar. This gave the U.S. leverage far beyond economics. Nations complied with the dollar standard not because they believed in its intrinsic value, but because not complying risked being locked out of energy markets entirely. To lose dollar access was to lose access to fuel, and to lose fuel was to choke your entire economy. The ghost of Bretton Woods had returned, but it now wore a mask of coercion. Unlike gold, which could be withdrawn and secured, oil flowed through choke points, pipelines, and straits, all of them vulnerable to political whim. The Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Turkish Straits, each became strategic arteries through which monetary control was exerted. The U.S. Navy didn't just patrol for stability, it patrolled for monetary enforcement. Sanctions became the new siege engines. When Venezuela challenged the dollar system, its oil exports were frozen. When Iran pursued euro-denominated oil sales, its banks were cut off from SWIFT, the lifeline of global payments. When Russia sought to price energy in rubles and yuan, it faced sanctions, asset seizures, and expulsion from dollar-based finance. No physical wall needed to be built. Financial exclusion was the modern blockade. And while central banks continued to stack treasuries, many quietly resumed buying gold. Not as a primary reserve, but as an insurance policy against a system that had begun to show cracks. China, Russia, Turkey, and even EU members like Germany and Hungary increased gold holdings, repatriating bullion from Western vaults. The unspoken message was clear. The dollar order still ruled, but its foundations were softening. Trust in the petrodollar wasn't faith, it was fear. Fear of exclusion, fear of punishment, fear of collapse. The post-gold system hadn't abolished hierarchy, it had merely replaced the metal with the molecule. Oil had become the surrogate for gold, and the dollar its high priest. But like all empires built on fear, this one too had begun to tremble under the weight of its contradictions. By the 2010s, the quiet murmurs of dissent against the petrodollar order had grown into a chorus of calculated defiance. The system still stood, but its scaffolding had begun to creak. China, ascending as a global manufacturing superpower and the world's largest oil importer, took the first bold steps toward unraveling the dollar's monopoly. In 2018, Beijing launched the petro-yuan, oil contracts priced in Chinese currency and convertible into gold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. It was a subtle masterstroke, offering oil exporters, especially those under Western sanctions, a way to bypass the dollar, while still tethering trade to something with perceived intrinsic value. The move attracted Russia and Iran, both of whom were increasingly targeted by U.S. sanctions and eager to escape dollar-based punishment. Moscow began pricing more of its energy exports in rubles, euros, and yuan, while also accelerating its exit from U.S. Treasury holdings. At the same time, it expanded its gold reserves aggressively, repatriating bullion from London and increasing domestic production to make its central bank one of the largest gold holders on Earth. Iran, boxed out of the SWIFT network and crippled by sanctions, responded by bartering oil, transacting in rupees, euros, and even cryptocurrencies, forming an underground ecosystem of de-dollarized commerce. Meanwhile, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa began constructing a financial parallel world. They launched the New Development Bank as a counterweight to the IMF and experimented with cross-border payment systems that could function outside the SWIFT grid. While these measures seemed incremental on the surface, together they signaled a tectonic shift. The first coordinated attempt to challenge the dollar not with force but with alternatives. As these cracks widened, central banks around the world resumed an ancient practice that had long been treated as obsolete: stockpiling gold. From 2010 onward, global gold purchases by central banks reached levels not seen since the collapse of Bretton Woods. China quietly accumulated bullion through shadow state entities. Turkey converted foreign reserves into gold at an accelerated pace. Even European nations began demanding the repatriation of their gold holdings from New York and London, a subtle vote of no confidence in the current monetary order. Yet despite this growing wave of diversification, the dollar endured. Not because of inherent strength, but because of structural entanglement. The world was still tethered to oil priced in dollars, to debt denominated in dollars, to a financial system where the dollar remained the universal key. Any sudden rupture risked not just U.S. decline, but global collapse. And so, even as rivals plotted exit strategies, they moved cautiously, almost reluctantly, wary of triggering the very instability they sought to escape. The petrodollar's true genius had never been in dominance, it was independence. The US didn't need to crush its challengers outright, it only needed to ensure that every attempt at escape carried the risk of mutual destruction. But the illusion of permanence was fading. The dollar's oil throne had been built atop global cooperation and silent compliance. Now that silence was breaking. The 21st century marches forward under the shadow of an illusion slowly unraveling. That money can remain valuable without being tied to anything real. For decades, the petrodollar system masked this fragility, anchoring the dollar to oil, oil to global necessity, and necessity to unquestioned compliance. But now, the tides are turning. Climate imperatives, geopolitical instability, and technological disruption are fracturing the energy foundations that once made the dollar untouchable. The world is moving, slowly, unevenly, toward renewables, decentralization, and new sources of energy that do not require barrels shipped across oceans or priced in a single currency. As oil's monopoly fades, so too does the dollar's artificial demand. At the same time, global debt has ballooned to unprecedented levels. Sovereign borrowing, once justified by growth or crisis response, now functions as the primary engine of monetary survival. The U.S. alone owes over $35 trillion with APRASH, interest payments outpacing defense spending. Emerging markets groan under dollar-denominated debt they cannot print, and central banks resort to emergency tools that become permanent fixtures. Money is no longer a promise backed by value. It is a bet on future stability that grows shakier by the day. The contradictions pile up. Gold, dismissed as an obsolete relic, is quietly hoarded again. Oil, once the dollar's ultimate enforcer, is no longer guaranteed by American power, as the Middle East recalibrates toward China, Russia, and internal instability. Debt, the currency's new bedrock, has proven to be a foundation made of sand, expandable without limit, yet incapable of delivering lasting confidence. The system constructed in the backrooms of Washington and Riyadh in 1974, never voted on, never debated, now stands exposed as a geopolitical pact, masquerading as a monetary standard. And as its pillars shake, a new question rises that hasn't been seriously asked since Bretton Woods collapsed. What should give money its value? Should it be scarcity, like gold, utility, like oil, trust in debt and institutions, or something new, decentralized, perhaps digital, immune to the manipulations of banks and empires? There is no consensus, only anxiety. Governments double down on control. Central banks flirt with programmable currencies. Crypto advocates evangelize math-based systems immune to human corruption. But behind each proposal lies the same fear, that the current order cannot last. The final convergence is not a singular collapse or event. It is a gathering storm of pressures that can no longer be managed by tradition, force, or illusion. Energy markets are transforming. The political will to sustain unpayable debt is fraying. The dollar, for so long buoyed by oil and backed by nothing, floats uneasily in the currents of change. When the next global crisis strikes, whether monetary, military, or environmental, the world may be forced to choose again. Not just what to trade with, but what to believe in. And when that moment comes, the true foundation of value, scarcity, trust, control, or coercion, will be revealed. The petrodollar era is ending. What comes next will define not just currencies, but civilizations.